Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of No Rocket Ships. Jamie Hancock's here. My guest today is Paul Curtis, currently at EasyJet, who I met a few years ago when we were running a MACH conference in Amsterdam. He's now a firm, sort of integral part of the Commerce Futures community, along with his colleague Ian Chambers, and very supportive, but also quite sarky. So, welcome, Paul. Introduce
Thanks,
yourself and
Jamie.
the job that you do now.
So Paul Curtis, currently the CTO for EasyJet Airline, looking after everything related to commercial and customer. So the website, the mobile app, the reservations that sit behind it, and the product verticals that are a key part of how we deliver products at EasyJet.
And given that you've got a very important job, you are part of the Commerce Futures group and a reasonably active, sort of vocal part of the group. In fact, well, we might get onto the application you built for fun a little bit later on. But and this is not a blow smoke up Jamie's bum moment, but what brings you back into that group?
I think it's mostly about the people that are involved. Now, one of the things I've always struggled, particularly with the travel sector, and this will probably be the first thing I say that I end up regretting is, as a vertical, we are way behind most other verticals. So you get a very insular view of the world in terms of people who are airline experts, and it's a really complex industry. But from a commerce point of view, having come from my early days working for a company like Tesco, where you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of SKUs and you've got just-in-time fulfillment, and it's a very, very complex model to pitch up at EasyJet. And it's like, yeah, we sell seats. So you've got one SKU that you have to sell. Like, how difficult is that for you? And the fulfillment is getting people on board a plane. So you don't have all the challenges of delivering the right product to the right home at the right time. You just have to shepherd 180 people onto a metal tube and then fire them off at 600 miles an hour. So I think Commerce Futures as an environment was fascinating for me because it kind of level sets the complexity that I'm dealing with at EasyJet in the context of problems that are far more challenging, and it gives me the opportunity to speak to some really smart, capable people. Not all of them, and I won't name those who aren't by name, but it gives me the opportunity to tap into that hive mind about what does good look like in terms of selling products to customers. And I can then go back to EasyJet and, take those learnings and seem like the smartest person in the room. But actually, I just know the smartest people in the commerce world.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? I was talking to somebody at NRF who's also in the group that said what she takes from it is she takes back into the business. There are all these people that are really passionate about what they do. That's
Yeah.
kind of what she was saying. It's not that busy a group, but the reality is there's enough conversation in there that these are all people who really care about their jobs and want to do a good job, which not doesn't strike me as being unusual because I know them all. But yeah, interesting.
But there's
Right.
also that real practical application. So if I look at, we will go through a procurement process to look at a new CMS, for example. And whilst we can go through a well-tried process that we've run internally for a number of years, actually for me to talk to, a few hundred senior professionals from retailers who are running e-commerce estates all over the world and get a sense from them as to what's working, what's not working, that is infinitely more valuable than a paper-based exercise I can do with a bunch of salespeople. So there's that real value add that you get from that community.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And the danger, I suppose, is that given that there are 60 vendors in that market now instead of 10, as there were 10 years
Yeah.
ago, you could easily just go from 60 to five and get the wrong five. So
Yes.
there's all of the dangers that come with all of that. Anyway, my three questions for you. So today we're going to talk about the fact that you didn't used to have a job. You used to run a business on your own, and you've gone from being an employer to an employee, which is a very unusual journey. And I'm interested to talk to you about that. We're going to talk about big change because you've been through a huge, quite long change program at EasyJet. And thirdly, we're going to talk a bit about Mac. So talk me through the first one first. Gone from, I always want to ask this question because I could not work for anybody else ever. So I wonder, talk to me about that journey because you ran well, talk to me about the business that you ran and then moving into.
Yeah, so I first worked for EasyJet between 2005 and 2008, and I was the head of software engineering. And I kind of had a combination of a mental breakdown, personal crisis, that real sort of crisis of confidence that made me literally walk away from that business. And some of it was to do with being, fairly young in my career and, not conforming to the norms of the company as it was, and getting very frustrated that I don't belong here and I'm not being listened to and I want to do something different. So I literally walked away without having any kind of job. And, remember vividly that conversation I had with my wife that evening, who, nearly walked out the door. But we agreed in that moment that we would create our own business, use some of the leverage of, the time at EasyJet in terms of contacts and make a stab at it. And we were very, very lucky in terms of securing very early on a really good contract with Jet2. So they became our first and most long-lived client that we had when we ran the business. And, we were part of their transformation of their revenue management systems. We were part of helping them build out the Jet2 Holidays organization and some of the tech that sits behind that. And, it was a very successful period. And I remember at the time saying, I never, ever want to work for anyone else ever again. So to your point, Jamie, it was like, this was a non-negotiable. Being your own boss, thinking, do you know what? I don't want to work on Friday. I'm not going to work on Friday. I mean, it's liberating. However, the realities of running your own business are one, you actually end up having lots of bosses because, every CEO, every business that you're working for wants their pound of flesh. And when you're working in the airline sector, our clients included Jet2, included Airbus, Etihad, Qantas out in Sydney. So not only were you working for all of these very demanding businesses, you were working basically 6 days a week minimum because Etihad worked Sunday to Thursday. And the time zone you operated in was near on 24 hours because of, people like Qantas being on the other side of the planet. I've lost count of the number of very important calls I did with the board at board of Qantas, sat there in my underpants because it was 4 in the morning and there was no way I was getting dressed below the waistline. And when we got the job with EasyJet Holidays, so they were essentially a client of ours before I moved across to EasyJet, and it was really a dream role in terms of being able to greenfield an entire tech stack with complete autonomy in terms of how we do it, methodology, suppliers we want to work with, people we want to employ. And it was an incredibly liberating experience and an incredible success story. When I look back at EasyJet Holidays, since the launch in 2019, it's now a 2 billion turnover business making 250 million profit in its own right. And it's been a massive success. And I remember this moment with the CEO of EasyJet Holidays, and he sat me down and said, look, Paul, you've been, operating as a supplier and, interim CTO for 18 months now. You've got a choice. You either become a permanent member of staff or you leave us along with the people that you've got working for us. And it was one of those moments when I thought, I am enjoying my life so much right now. Why would I actually give that up? And I think the reality of becoming an employee versus an employer and running your own business is, on a relative scale, being the CTO for a startup business like EasyJet Holidays was infinitely less stress than running your own business. Because actually, you've got one boss, you don't have 6 or 7 bosses. You've got, at the end of the day, you kind of stop. And that was a really new experience for me and one I've not really got used to. But you can actually manage your time and stress levels a lot more. And, as you'll appreciate, Jamie, when you get to our sagely age, there's 2 key things for me, which is one, you kind of reevaluate values in life and what you need to enjoy your existence. And the other really liberating thing is you actually stop giving a shit. And I think that element of how you operate is quite empowering. you're able to make quick decisions, you're able to ask for forgiveness, not permission. And I think in the context of something like EasyJet Holidays, where we had to move at breakneck speed, having a CEO that was willing to allow you to operate in that way and give you the autonomy, for me, was the sweet spot. So definitely no regrets. And if I knew 10 years ago the version of myself and what I'd be doing, I wouldn't believe it.
That's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I actually shared a couple of LinkedIn posts recently from my own journey to business ownership rather than having been an employee. And a bit like you, I was sort of almost forced to start a business because I
Yeah.
hated my job so much.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
I had no other choice. I couldn't continue to be an employee because I was becoming the worst version of an employee
Yeah.
and was causing me untold stress and, couldn't sleep and all that sort of stuff. So I found it much more stress free having three bosses than having one. But then I
Interesting.
was in sales, that's always the case, right? Because
Yeah.
you want more bosses because if you lose one, you've still got two.
No,
Whereas, yeah,
exactly.
yeah, okay.
Exactly.
Whereas, yeah, different businesses. Okay, well, that was a great bit of shit. I didn't know all that. That's fantastic. Thank you. So after the success of EasyJet Holidays, you were then asked to take on a much more dangerous, or I don't know, that like the big beast, right? The airline business,
Yeah.
and I suppose I don't want you to go into the soups and nuts of it, but huge change project, which is what, at least 2 years, I think now. You're 2 years in. Just tell me the best bits, given what you already talked about, and the worst bits of a really big change program that the sorts of which you've been involved in are still involved in.
Yeah, I'll start with the best bits. I think it's a very difficult thing to do, and people's human nature is to be adverse to change. So if you come in and you're, laying out plans to completely transform ways of working, how teams are structured, introduce a whole new organizational design into a part of business, it's an incredibly disruptive thing to do, particularly when the work doesn't stop. There's still an expectation from the board that we will continue to deliver and see benefits from this. So the positives for me are, when you've got very capable people within an organization that actually want to grow and learn and adapt, you see those individuals really, really thrive in that change scenario. And I think you start to see people that maybe are, in the background, haven't really come to the fore, who are really forced to, step out their comfort zone, put themselves, head above the parapet and really demonstrate what they can offer. And you really start to see people grow and adapt and evolve and really mature and flourish in that environment. And it's really empowering when you see that impact, and then you also see it play out in terms of when you start to come out the other side, you actually do that reflection. You look back and say, well, actually, we're now doing 5 times the number of app releases than we used to do. We're doing 8 times the number of web releases. We can now do fully automated deployments to the website. And it's very easy when you're in the thick of it to be all doom and gloom and, the classic emotional cycle of change. You start off with this real excitement and rally the troops, and then 3 months later, you're in the depths of the trough of disillusionment, and, people are walking around dragging their heels. This is like horrible and too difficult. But when you're coming out the other side and you start to see those changes, you also start to see that real belief and reaffirmation of the people in the teams. And the best ones for me are those that, when you first talk about the transformation that you're about to do, and you get those naysayers that say, we've tried to do this many times before, and, whatever you do, don't put us on another agile training course because I freaking hate them and they never teach me anything. To have those same people 2 years later fighting your corner, saying why it's a great model, saying why they're enjoying what they're doing and why it's transformational, it's probably the best part of it when you really see that affected change. And the other key thing that we've started to really focus on is, when you're making that level of change, one of the most important aspects of how people behave is trust, and trusting each other to actually have your back, understand where we're going, really, be behind what we're doing. And there's a great book that was written by the founder of Wikipedia, a guy called Jimmy Wales, called The Seven Rules of Trust. And he talks a lot about, when he started Wikipedia, and when you reflect on it, the notion that you could have a bunch of random individuals around the internet trusted to provide reliable, accurate information about all and sundry, and for it not to become the Wild West and be self-policing. Like it's insane that that even, became a thing. And it's those trust elements that, we've really tried to focus on in the last few months in particular, where, you do break trust with people when you say, look, this is going to be hard. And there are people that are negatively impacted as a result of that change. So, to the hard bits, it's all about the people elements. You've got individuals who might not have the skills, might not have the appetite, have been very comfortable what they're doing, and sometimes for years and years and years and years. And you're suddenly coming along and saying, yeah, everything you've been doing for the last 5 years, it's wrong. It's not how we want to operate. And that is incredibly destabilizing. So trying to manage the balance between those that are going to thrive and really be part of the future, and those that might need coaching and a lot of support, and frankly, those who have no interest in being part of that future, and how you manage that scenario. It's a really difficult part of it. But I think the nice thing for me is we're coming through it. We're starting to see the real green shoots of that new way of working. And I think the team we have in place now are mostly fully bought into it and understand the value it's going to bring. And ultimately, are enjoying their job a lot more than they used to.
And also, presumably for you, you do get to stop, so you're not carrying it around at 8:30 at night as you
No,
might have done in a
exactly.
previous life.
Exactly. I mean, I am naturally a workaholic, so if I'm not actively being engaged on it, I am thinking about it. I'm making notes. I'm recording myself little voice memos. Usually, when I'm in the shower, I have this waterproof microphone that's very useful
Really?
for recording those moments of clarity that you get when you're brushing your teeth, butt naked, with bar of soap in your hand. I'll stop the analogy there.
Yes, stop there. Stop there. And we should just before we move on to our third section, we should take the point to prove that you are a workaholic by saying that anybody who's read Rocket Ship's newsletter or knows me on LinkedIn will know that I'm the voice of the Commerce Futures WhatsApp group. And the WhatsApp group fucking hates Trustpilot and OneTrust. We absolutely, the mafia sales tactics, the terrible price rises, all of it just drives everybody insane. And Paul took it upon himself before Christmas to build our own version of Trustpilot inside the group, um, which was very good fun. And
Yeah,
I'm not sure
it's still
quite whether
there.
it's still there. I
Yeah.
think there is definitely a sort of democratic version of Trustpilot which we should all launch as a collective.
Well,
Um,
yeah, I mean, just following on from the Wikipedia example, can we do that truly democratized feedback on businesses that actually can be trusted to not be fully automated, overly managed, commercialized to the point that no one can really trust what's on there? It would be a great case study.
it would. Once I've got RTS out of the way, we'll think about whether
Yeah,
we
I'll come
can,
back to that
whether
one.
we can do that. Okay, so final section. We met when we were probably 3 years ago, and I think when I was doing the second of the MACH conferences,
Yeah,
and I was introduced to you as a potential speaker, and at the time you had one, I think, piece of software in EasyJet holidays that was sort of MACH compliant, and we won't bore everybody with the journey of that,
yeah,
but you weren't particularly Mac anything. You were sort of vaguely Mac curious. I suppose you became a little bit Mac curious during that conference build up
yeah,
and the process. But since then, you've become, actually pretty involved. You're now on the executive board, I think. I certainly, whenever I need anything done, whenever I need anybody to go and host something or do anything great, let's bring Paul. Um, so you're involved. So just talk to me about that journey, because the Mac Alliance gets gets a press, doesn't it? It gets a press of being whatever. I don't know anymore really, but yeah,
Yeah.
just as it from a customer's perspective, just talk to me about it.
Yeah, no, Mac's been a really interesting journey for me. So I think I'm naturally averse to doing many conferences, mostly because whenever I'm on stage or have a microphone in my hand, I usually say something that gets me into trouble. The most famous was at the Travolution conference when I was asked about the challenges of recruitment. And I said, look, the biggest problem EasyJet has is it's based in Luton. And let's face it, Luton is a shithole. And hadn't fully appreciated the status that EasyJet has as a company in Luton as one of the primary employees and a flag bearer for commerce in Luton. So from that point onwards, I've always been a little bit reticent to get involved in too many conferences. And I almost begrudgingly agreed to do Mac 2 in Amsterdam, partly because you were such a charming and endearing person, Jamie. And I thought there's a guy who I can learn from and get some sagely experience from.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so I turned up with reasonably low expectations, not least because EasyJet put me up in a you know, I can't even remember what it was. It was some horrible, horrible hotel where the only food option was pot noodles that I had to ask behind the counter for. So I was not in a good state of mind when I went to that conference. But what really surprised me was it was the first time I'd been involved in anything where there wasn't a massive push on selling. There was a community of people that were very willing to be utterly transparent and honest about their experiences, what they're trying to do, particularly in the context of Mac as a principle and composable. And you had a lot of organizations that were early on in their journey. They were, to some extent, evangelical about what it meant for them and what they were able to achieve, but they were also incredibly realistic about how difficult it was, the challenges they were facing, and there was a real sense of genuine community in the room in terms of people sharing relevant ideas rather than, each metaphorically rolling their dick out across the stage and saying how big it was. It was a real humbling experience to some extent.
Do you think? I mean, I completely get that, and people I've talked to who've been speakers have said that. You know, every time I've asked, and I think it's true. By the way, obviously I've designed them all, but I do think that's true. People are, and it is very difficult, and it is a challenging process. My question, therefore, is for a big organisation, and you work with loads of big organisations, is that composable thing, the Mac thing, is that sort of inevitable in some form now?
I don't think it is. And the reason I say that is, large organizations will invest millions and millions and millions in these very large SAP, Salesforce, Oracle, choose your big vendor. And there's that almost that sunk cost fallacy that they have, which is I've invested so many tens of millions in this as a CFO. There is no way I want to write that off or risk moving away from it. And in a lot of instances, it's a bit of a safe play. And I think, not wanting to steal some of Mac's thunder as in the Mac Alliance and what they're looking to do, but there's been that real acknowledgement that for us to be truly relevant to enterprise, there needs to be that engagement with the Salesforce and SAPs of this world in terms of how do those large monolithic platforms play in a Mac ecosystem. And actually, when you look at some of what, particularly organizations like Salesforce are doing, they are starting to acknowledge that composable is a thing. They have to be relevant to that and understand that whilst they might have this huge platform of capabilities that they can sell to big enterprises, and CIO can sign one big contract and then sit back in his chair and drink his whiskey and smoke his big fat cigar. The reality is that they are starting to respond to that change in direction. And I think the Mac Alliance are now saying, look, we need to engage those big vendors and we need to understand how do those two worlds play together. And then as soon as you start to blend in all of the work that we're doing around, agentic, actually, there has to be that synergy.
Yes, I think my question wasn't kind of, are we going to have to replace those old ones? Because I agree with you, and to a large degree, everybody I've spoken to who's probably ever spoken at a MACH conference has got one of those big old things, and they're not
Yeah.
going anywhere. They're not going anywhere. None of them ever are, really.
No.
Nobody's. But I suppose I didn't ask my question very well, but it's that bit at the front, which is, I don't know, was 10% and now is 20 or even 30% of the
Yeah.
business. That bit's got to be something else,
No, I
because
100% agree. And again, if we look at where the world is going, and I think at the last MACX conference, the statement was made that by 2030, the expectation is that over 60% of all e-commerce transactions will be done through agentic platforms. Whether that's true or not is kind of irrelevant. What it does indicate is the direction of travel is if you aren't able to decompose your web journeys, your commerce experiences, and support, the concept of non-linear book flows, then there's a real risk that it won't be that you're not relevant, it's that you're not even present in that new world that we're moving into. But I think that's where the composable piece really plays into it, because actually, if you're able to, decompose all of those elements of the online booking journey in any commerce scenario, then you can actually see how you can play in all of those different parts of the user journey in whatever sequence a customer's tapping requests into ChatGPT or whatever conversational tool they're using.
it was I went to NRF in January. I don't think I did very much work, if I'm honest, but I did wander around being cold
A
for a
lot of
few days.
drinking?
No, I don't know why I went, to be perfectly honest. But anyway, it was nice. But I had dinner with some of the Common Futures crew, and there was the CDO from a large American premium luxury business sitting next to me. And they were talking about being all in on AI. And I said, what does that really mean? And he said, actually, the reality of it really means that you need to set your procurement processes up right now so that you can onboard a vendor in a week, less than a week. You need
Yeah.
to be able to engage with that world so that and that means CFOs and procurement and all those guys being able to change to behave very differently than they would have done in the past, and get your sort of data. So lots of change to prepare for this stuff isn't really about some great big Mac migration. A lot of it's just about, can you buy something quickly and bin it quickly? Can you bin it quickly? And if you bin it quickly, have you done any damage in the business while you've been using it? Have you been safe in the way that you've used it? Because the stack's going to change
Yeah.
massively. Almost twice, 2 or 3 times X the way that everybody's been changing it for the last 4 or 5 years, I think.
Yeah. No, I agree.
All right. What else do you want to say?
Yeah. So I guess just sort of closing out on the Mac element, I think, building on from that initial engagement and why I've ended up getting deeper and deeper into Mac, I think a lot of it is just being able to spend time with smart people. And that sounds really, really contrived, but actually one of the things that I observe with Mac conferences versus other conferences is that for whatever reason, it does seem to attract the more forward-thinking CTOs, CMOs, CPOs from organizations who all seem to be aligned in some of the principles and what they want to do. And I think the other key thing is when I look at the challenge of buying software, I mean, I think I don't want to say dislike, I think hatred is probably a better word of salespeople in general. The ability to stand up on stage at Mac and call, salespeople dicks, and then have those same salespeople hound me with their anecdotes about why they're not a dick. For me, Mac was really an opportunity to do that, have those sales conversations with actual consumers of products. And it sounds like a fairly nebulous thing, but that is so empowering, particularly when you talk about the challenge around procurement and how large enterprises can move more quickly. But it's also bled into some of the processes we've now put in place in EasyJet. So if I want to buy a new product, I now no longer need to fill out a 200-line procurement document, request for information, and an RFP. We can do a quick assessment, gather all of the evidence that exists that supports a particular argument or clearly indicates which companies we should be talking to. And we're now able to, in parallel, start a somewhat traditional procurement process to kick the tires and make sure that they're viable organizations. But in parallel, do actual proof of techs with these companies. And the reason they're so powerful is that one, you get to actually test the technology and see it, warts and all. But you also get to engage the people within the organization. You get a sense of the culture of these organizations you're dealing with. Historically, I've lost count of the number of times we've gone through this long, drawn out process. We make a decision, and on day one, you have that first workshop, and you're like, these guys are fucking idiots. Like, why are we working with them? And it's like, well, you've signed the 5-year contract now. You've made your bed. You've got to lie in it, and it's so soul destroying. So to
It's
cut
really
through,
interesting, isn't it? I think, go back to the Common Futures group. There was a member who did a great big procurement process for a new econ platform last year, and I think they fed back into the group that they chose between two vendors, both of which were not very far apart, but they chose one because they
yeah,
thought, well, I'm going to have to work with these people for the next 3 years, and they're going to be nicer to work with than the other lot. So and that's why they won. And I think you almost want to applaud everybody in that situation, don't you? The vendor and the customer
no, exactly.
for realizing that was the case and not doing a feature function bastard fest, as we now call it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, look, we're way over my 25-minute deadline. But Mr. Curtis, thank you very much for taking
Thank you,
part
Jamie.
again. And I'm sure I will see you very soon.
You will indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ta-ta for now.